Today I'm going to be talking about how I painted the Chaos Space Marine kill team. Every time that I even think about painting or getting into painting and stuff like that, I kind of go through like the general, the always steps, the things I always will do. You know, besides basing them and assembling them and getting rid of all the mold lines and stuff like that, I'm going to go and paint them with a prime of black. And once I've got the priming out of the way, then I'm going to do a Zenithal. Zenithal can be more than just the basic idea of spraying top down. That's what people think, oh, Zenithal, top down, doing it. And you paint it white and then you kind of graded the gradients. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. One of the things you can do when it comes to Zenithal is to ratchet it up a little bit. And so instead of going, hey, this is where all the light is going or landing, now you can start picking out the volumes. And of course you're already doing that with a Zenithal. So hold on for a second. But say a Space Marine, or a Chaos Space Marine in this example, I'm going to be hitting the main areas of where the volumes of the model are. Okay, so I'm going to be showing the shoulder pad, but instead of doing the entire shoulder pad, I'm going to be more specific in the targeting of that. I'm going to do one side of it, making sure that the back side of it is not, or the leg, I'm going to do the main central cylinder of the leg and make sure I leave the sides of the cylinder alone. And so it's less about the Zenithal where it's the overarching point going from one point down. I'm now picking out more areas and being more specific about where I'm placing the Zenithal kind of thing. And in doing this, it gives you a way of creating volumes or creating gradients in a really simple, clean and effective way. And I think that's really cool because a lot of people don't want to do gradients because it's a pain in the ass. And doing it by hand is, well, I wouldn't classify that as fun. So, doing it through an airbrush makes a world of difference. So now after you've created or done the Zenithal lighting, picked out your volumes and stuff like that, it's now time to get to the main color. So we want to figure out what that color is going to be. For this thing, I was like, I'm going to do a kind of a hot pink, purple, magenta kind of thing. Just thought it'd be kind of cool, it'd be fun, it'd be a bit Slaanesh, doesn't have to be, but I was like, that'd be fun thing to do. So I ended up mixing some colors. I have a bit of ink, which I like because of the fluidity, and it's really high, high strength in its kind of color. And I also added some purple from Scale Artist colors. I mixed the two together, get the right consistency, add a drop or two of thinner, just to make sure. Not too thin. You want to avoid being a glaze because it'll take a while to create the gradient, but you don't want it to be so thick because you want to make sure the gradients that you've created are actually doing the job that you want them to do. Put it in and fire it onto the model. Effectively, you're spraying the entire model. The blacks that you kind of missed with your Zenithaling are going to be a bit more purpley. Your whites are definitely going to show up more purple. I kind of think it's a good place to start would be in the mid-tone territory. Slightly on the brighter side because it's easier to make things darker by glazing. If you glaze on top of a bright color, you can diminish it or make it less bright. So that gives you better control on your shadows. And if you get the mid-tone right, then you've kind of got the major color down. So I think that's a good place to kind of generally start. Everyone's a little different. I feel some people might want to start from darker, going brighter, but I find that's a bit harder to do. And if you really want good punch or good contrast, then you would end up trying to put paint on top of white to get that brightest effect, especially when it comes to a color. I mean, as you can see, I'm taking my time just going through all of the models that I've got, leaving places that I know that I'm going to paint a different color alone, and then just painting the purple on top. I'm doing it all sort of in a batch paint. I did one model to start with to kind of give me a general sense about how or what I'm going to be doing, and then the rest of them I'm just going through. And I'm a big fan or a big believer on doing a test model, especially when you're going to do a batch paint, because there are lots of little pitfalls that you may not be aware of, may not have thought of, and it's great to get those out of the way by doing a test model first. Once you've created your mid-tone and you've done your purple color, or you've done your color that you're looking for, what ends up happening is that things look, I don't know, I would think the best word I could utilize is disjointed. You've got a blackish color, which has got a bit of purple because you've sprayed over it, and then you've got this kind of punchy, bright well, in this terms, pink color. But you really want those two ends of the spectrum to be kind of cohesive, or to connect with each other appropriately, to allow our eyes to make that really nice gradient. And so the way that we do this, we keep with the airbrush, is we utilize a darker color right here and now. The first probably thought for a lot of people would be like, oh, I'm going to use a dark purple now. And I would go, it's nice to try and pivot away from that slightly. So I'm actually going to be utilizing a sort of dark blue color. And I think I'm using a dark green color, and on top of purple, it makes a blue. And I am spraying this in a glaze. So this is very thin. So it's several drops of thinner to your paint ratio. And I'm being quite careful, and I'm really only shooting in the shadows of the model. I'm just doing all the underside sections, and I'm doing my best to be careful and to make sure that I'm creating these smooth, very nice looking transitions by applying a little extra color to the model. I like to utilize a different color because I think it makes the model look more interesting. If I use the same purple, or just make it a slightly darker one, or just use the Liquitex purple ink just by itself, yes, it would work. But I think it loses some nuance, some interesting factor inside it. And so I'm just using something slightly off. A very dark green was in this one, but I think a dark blue would also work. Something along those lines. Very thin, you're applying it in a glaze form and just trying to punch it in the shadows. As you work through that on each one of your models, you'll find that it just starts to look so much more nice, cohesive, and connected. Once you've completed your model in terms of the gradients and you're pretty happy with it, it's now time to do the rest of it, or at least bring it up to a point where you're like, okay, this is where it needs to be. The whole difference between Chaos Space Marines and regular Space Marines pretty much comes down to the trim. Chaos Space Marines have so much more trim than regular Space Marines, so they just take a fair bit more work. So here I'm going to take black, just regular old black, and I'm just going to paint all the trims black. And that's probably the least fun part of this whole thing, and it takes time and effort, and you have to be pretty careful with what you're doing, because you really don't want to mess with any of the gradients that you've put down at this point. But the reason why we're painting it black, or getting color down that's different, is because though we would paint like a metal color on top of the trim, we want the crevices, we want the deeper parts to be black. And we need them to not show out purple. It will look like we wouldn't have painted it properly if we don't paint it black. Also, we're giving a regular coverage of paint for the true metallic metalwork that we're doing to show up more uniformed across the whole model. Painting on top of different colors affects the way that things look. So we're trying to make it more uniform. One of the things that I didn't do super well in this, though I did do it, but not as well as I could have, is where the armor plates meet the trim, you really would like to get the corner painted black. Because if you got that bit black, then you'll have this darker color between the trim piece and the actual armor plate. And this means that you'll create really fine definition on the model. And the better your definition on a model, the easier it is to read for our eyes. So that's the thing. When I was painting the metal, just like I would do with non-metallic metal, in true metallic metal, I tend to start with a darker bronze, or bronze in this sense, but gold or whatever, dark silver, something of that nature, and you build it up, going for higher highlights. So you start with the base, that's everything, and then you do your mid-tones, which will be smaller than your base, so meaning you're taking up less surface area by your painting, so you make sure that the base shows itself, and then you work in smaller spaces until you get to your highest highlights. Now that can take some time, and that's a bit of effort, but depending on what you're looking for, that's what I'm looking for, that's what I will do. So my bronze color starts with a mixture of bronze and a bit of gold, and then I actually work my way almost directly to white gold, which is sort of an off silver color, and that works really well for me. It just kind of creates like different variances in patina. It allows me to do some edge highlighting, and make a nice effect with it all. So that's where I go with my metals. There were some, you know, like miscellaneous, like other pieces on the model that aren't like those main areas. Partly it's like to do with like the gun pouch, or there's some skulls on the shoulder, or just like skulls in other places and things like that. I just utilized the same sort of like leathery brown color that I had, and I started using that as sort of the main base for the skull, and then I knew that I'd just sort of work my way up. But partly painting things or getting the base color down can be very helpful in seeing what you might do with the next part of painting. I see sometimes where like a person is painting a model and they'll just paint the sword and they won't have painted the rest of it, or they'll paint the head and some other bit of it, but they haven't painted the other parts. And I'm sure everyone's a bit different here in regards to how they can observe or how they see their model. But I do find it quite useful to bring a lot of it up together, rather than to try and do full completion of one thing and then work on a different section. I'm sure people work different. I mean, we know that people work differently, and partly of that is finding the way that you like doing it. But because the model as a whole is how we see it, I find that it's useful to bring up the entire thing roughly together so that you get a good sense of where things are going, and that like one part is like not completely different than another section, if that makes sense. So, I mean, yeah, I'm still basing just the regular base color that I'm utilizing across the model. I'm going to silvers, and I'm going to my bronzes, and I'm trying to pick out the various other miscellaneous little details that are there, and just trying to go about that, trying to bring them up to a point where I'm like, ah, this is looking quite good. This guy with a sword, and like he's like the champion guy, which I quite like. I found that the bluish color that I was using for my recess shade, like the shading section on the with the airbrush, actually was a nice blue, or like a nice turquoisey blue color, and worked as a great undertone for the skin. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a neat effect. And so you paint skin on it, and all of a sudden you got like these like funny like bluish shadows like in the top parts of the eyes or in the skin, and it kind of gives it a slightly otherworldly kind of sickly skin tone, which I was like, oh, that's really kind of a cool thing to have. One of the things what I was doing once the model was like pretty good and I was pretty happy with it, I would like to use a little bit of inks from here and there to go into some of the recesses. I'm just trying to control some of the dark areas. I'm trying to make sure that the deepest recesses, or like the points between plates and trim, are appropriately dark enough to give the distinction between individual pieces. And inks also allow you to play with little different bits of color without covering any of the details that you got, because they're, you know, particularly like translucent effectively. And I find them to be quite nice to give like a little effect to the model. Let's get to maybe the fun part. Once you've got your model looking pretty sharp and you're feeling pretty good about things, I moved to getting to the plasma glow effect. And I don't know if there are different ways of approaching this, but there are ways that I like to do it, or this is the way that I think makes the most sense to me. You spray the white directly onto the area that you think that you know that's going to be glowing. We then take our first pass with a color of your choice. I think there's like fluorescent colors out there. I don't own any. I would love to get some, but I don't own any yet. I'm utilizing a blue, like a very strong but like light blue color, to shoot just a little bit around that area to represent the glow, if that makes any sense. You'll then use a brush. You're going to use a white directly to the area in which that you're looking for it to be the brightest spot. So generally that is going to be the coils on something. So with the plasma gun that we're utilizing, the main block section, which will be glowing, where the light source will be, I will paint that with additional white so it's as bright as it can be. And the gradient has been created by the airbrush that we utilize. Get yourself some acrylic retarder. Acrylic retarder has really low surface tension, so it breaks the water or breaks the paint, and it causes it to flow. And so when you got plasma coils, you got all these little indentations within the coil effectively, and with enough mixture of retarder and white, the white will actually flow into the crevices of that area, and those will then become the brightest spots. You'll also paint the lines as well. So then once you've gotten that bit done, you go back to the airbrush with the same color that you've got, and you spray lighter or more lightly over that white, and you just off-white it slightly. So it's not pure white, and it blends things really nicely. You don't even need to wait for the paint to dry. You can just kind of go directly on top of it, and you'll get this kind of nice glow effect. So you can kind of see with the model, with the flame and the sword, how the white that shows through really shows like the luminescence that's coming out of it, so it makes it look like it's popping. And because his hand is so dark, especially the other side of it, it gives the appearance that there's light on one side and darkness on the other side. And you can see with his shoulder pad that I used the same blue and kind of fired over that area where I thought the color would be, to give the sense that that color is awashing the area. Hopefully with what you've seen, it gives you a sense about how you can approach gradients in a straightforward and simple method. I never went back to the armor. The only thing that I did in the armor that you guys didn't really see was me edge highlighting certain spots. So just to make sure that I'm picking out some of the details and allowing distinction between the various armor plates and things like that. But once we created the gradient with the initial run, we left it. And that's kind of it really. And then it just came down to trim work and doing all the various little details. The faces take a bit of time, doing the plasma glows, making sure all of those things just look the way that they should. It's all pretty straightforward. Remember, again, we're just building up layers, we're working in smaller and smaller places, even though it's a tiny ass model, making sure that all the things are defined and that there's separation between everything. And when you get that, you get a model that looks pretty sharp. I'm pretty happy with how my kill team turned out. There's just 6 models, and I painted them to what I feel like is a pretty good standard for me, and I'm going to be really happy to put them out on the field. So there you go. Hopefully that is somewhat helpful. There'll be more to come. They'll be better, and they'll be worse.